Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Bright on Buddhism. This week we will be reading and discussing Part 3 of Chapter 2 of DT Suzuki's translation of the Laṅkāvatāra Sūtra. The title roughly translates to Discourse of the Descent into Lanka. The text recounts Shakyamuni giving the teaching to a bodhisattva named Mahamati, or Great Wisdom, as they bring the Dharma to the mythical land of Lanka, often interpreted as being modern-day Sri Lanka, which is ruled by Ravana, the king of the Rakshasas. The Lankavatarara Sutra discusses numerous Mahāyāna concepts, such as Yogācāra mind-only doctrine, the three natures, the Alaya Vijnana, Gotra theory, Buddha nature, the luminous mind, emptiness, and vegetarianism. In this section, Mahamati and the Buddha discuss the mind-made body, the true nature of nirvana, and causality in depth. We hope you enjoy. At that time, Mahamati, the Bodhisattva Mahasattva, in consideration of future generations, made this request again of the Blessed One. Pray tell me, Blessed One, about the perfecting of the discipline whereby the Bodhisattva Mahasattvas become great yogins. The Blessed One replied, There are 4 things, Mahamati, by fulfilling which the Bodhisattvas become great yogins. What are the 4? They are 1. To have a clear understanding as to what is seen of mind itself. 2. To discard the notions of birth, abiding, and disappearance. 3. To look into the truth that no external world obtains. And 4. To seek for the attainment of inner realization by noble wisdom. Provided with these 4 things, the Bodhisattva Mahasattvas become great yogins. How, Mahamati, does the Bodhisattva Mahasattva come to have a clear understanding as to what is seen of mind itself? He comes to it by recognizing that this triple world is nothing but mind itself, devoid of an ego and its belongings, with no strivings, no comings and goings, that this triple world is manifested and imagined as real under the influence of the habit energy accumulated since beginningless time by false reasoning and imagination, and with the multiplicity of objects and actions in close relationship and in conformity with the ideas of discrimination, such as body, property, and abode. Thus, Mahamati, the Bodhisattva Mahasattva acquires a thoroughly clear understanding as to what is seen of mind itself. How again, Mahamati, does the Bodhisattva Mahasattva discard notions of birth, abiding, and disappearance? By this it is meant that all things are to be regarded as forms born of a vision or a dream, and have never been created, since there are no such things as self, the other, or bothness. The Bodhisattvas will see that the external world exists only in conformity with mind only, and seeing that there is no stirring of the Vijnanas, and that the triple world is a complicated network of causation and owes its rise to discrimination, they find that all things, inner and external, are beyond predicability, that there is nothing to be seen as self-nature, and that the world is not to be viewed as born, and thereby they will conform themselves to the insight that things are not of the nature of a vision, etc., and attain to the recognition that things are unborn. Establishing themselves on the 8th stage of bodhisattvahood, they will experience a revulsion in their consciousness by transcending the citta, manas, and manovijnana, and the 5 dharmas, and the 3 svabhavas, and the twofold egolessness, and thereby attain the mind-made body, mano-mayakaya. Thus, Mahamati, the Bodhisattva Mahasattva will discard the notion of birth, abiding, and disappearance. Said Mahamati, What is meant by the will body, Blessed One? The Blessed One replied, It means that one in this body can speedily move unobstructed as he wills, hence the will body, Mahamati. For instance, Mahamati, the will or mind travels unobstructed over mountains, walls, rivers, trees, etc. Many 100,000 yojanas they may be away, when a man recollects the scenes which had previously come into his perception, while his own mind keeps on functioning in his body without the least interruption or hindrance. In the same fashion, Mahamati, the will body, in the attainment of the samadhi called Maya-like, and adorned with such marks as the powers, the psychic faculties, and the self-control, will be born in the noble paths and assemblies, moving about as freely as he wishes, as he recalls his original vows and worlds in order to bring all beings to maturity. Then, Mahamati, what is meant by the Bodhisattva Mahasattva having good insight into the non-existence of external objects? It means, Mahamati, that all things are like unto a mirage, a dream, a hairnet, And seeing that all things are here essentially because of our attachment to the habit energy of discrimination which has been maturing since beginningless time, on account of false imagination and erroneous speculation, the bodhisattvas will seek after the attainment of self-realization by their noble wisdom. Mahamati, furnished with these four things, bodhisattva mahasattvas become great yogins. Therefore, in these Mahamati, you should exercise yourself. At that time, Mahamati again made a request of the Blessed One. Pray tell me, Blessed One, about the causation of all things, whereby I and other bodhisattva mahasattvas can see into the nature of causation, and by getting rid of the discrimination which issues in the philosophical views of eternalism and nihilism, we may no more discriminate as to the gradual or simultaneous rising of all things. Replied the Blessed One, Mahamati, there are two factors of causation by which all things come into existence, external and inner. Mahamati, the external factors are a lump of clay, a stick, a wheel, thread, water, a worker, and his labor, the combination of all which produces a jar. As with the jar, Mahamati, which is made of a lump of clay, or a piece of cloth made of thread, or a matting made of fragrant grass, or the sprout growing out of a seed, or fresh butter which is produced from sour milk by a man churning it with his own labor, so it is, Mahamati, with all things which, governed by external causes, appear one after another in continuous succession. As regards the inner factors of causation, Mahamati, they are of such kind as ignorance, desire, and action, which make up our idea of causation. Born of these, Mahamati, there is the manifestation of the skandhas, dhatus, and ayatanas. They are not separable realities, but discriminated as such by the ignorant. Now, Mahamati, there are 6 causes. 1. Possibility cause. 2. Dependence cause. 3. Objectivity cause. 4. Agency cause. 5. Manifesting cause. And 6. Indifference cause. The possibility cause means, Mahamati, that when a cause to be becomes effective, there is the rising of things inner and outer. The dependence cause means, Mahamati, that when conditions to be become effective, there is the rising of the skandha seeds, etc., inner and outer. Further, the objectivity cause means, Mahamati, that bound by the objective world, the Vijnana keeps up its continuous activity. Again, Mahamati, the agency cause means that like a sovereign king, a cause invested with supreme authority asserts itself. Again, the manifesting cause means that when the discriminating faculty arises, as the result it reveals individual marks as a lamp does forms, etc. Lastly, the indifference cause means that when there is a dissolution, the power of combination discontinues, and there arises a state of non-discrimination. These, Mahamati, are the outcome of discrimination carried on by the ignorant and simple-minded, and there is no gradual nor simultaneous rising of existence. Why? Because, Mahamati, if there is a simultaneous rising of existence, there will be no distinction between cause and effect, and there would be nothing to characterize a cause as such. If a gradual rising is admitted, there is no substance that holds together individual signs, which makes gradual rising impossible. While a child is not yet born, Mahamati, the term father has no significance. The logician argues that there is that which is born and that which gives birth by the mutual functioning of such causal factors as cause, subsistence, continuity, acceleration, and others, and they conclude that there is a gradual rising of existence. But Mahamati, this gradual rising does not obtain except by reason of their attachment to the notion of self-nature. When the ideas of body, property, and abode are cherished in what is nothing but the manifestation of mind itself, the external world is perceived under the aspects of individuality and generality, which, however, are not realities. And therefore, Mahamati, neither a gradual nor a simultaneous rising of things is possible. It is only when the Vijnana evolves by reason of discrimination, which discriminates the manifestation of mind itself, that existence is said to come into view. For this reason, Mahamati, you must strive to get rid of notions of gradation and simultaneity in the combination of the causal activities. Thus it is said, nothing whatever is born or ceases to exist by reason of causation. When causation is discriminated, there is birth and cessation. It is not to keep off the idea of birth and disappearance which takes place in causation. It is to keep off the wrong imagination as to causation, which is cherished by the ignorant. The being and non-being of things subject to causation has no reality. The triple world owes its existence to the mind, put into confusion by reason of habit energy. not ever being in existence, what things are there that are born? But in causation nothing is lost. When effect-producing objects are regarded as like unto a barren woman's child or a flower in the sky, one perceives that grasping subject and grasped object are an error, and desists from committing the same error. There is nothing that is to be born, nor is there anything that has been born. Even causation is not. It is because of wordly usage that things are talked of as existing. At that moment, again, Mahamati the Bodhisattva Mahasattva said this to the Blessed One. Pray tell me, Blessed One, about the teaching known as the essence of discrimination as regards words, whereby, Blessed One, I and other Bodhisattva Mahasattvas, comprehending and becoming well acquainted with the essence of discrimination as regards words, will be thoroughly informed of the signification of two things, expression and expressed, and thereby, immediately attaining supreme enlightenment, will explain the signification of these two things, expression and expressed, for the purification of all beings. Replied the Blessed One, Then, Mahamati, listen well and reflect well, for I will tell you about it. Well done, said Mahamati the Bodhisattva Mahasattva, and listened to the Blessed One. The Blessed One said this to him, There are, Mahamati, 4 kinds of word discrimination. They are, 1. Words denoting individual marks. 2. Dream words. 3. Words growing out of the attachment to erroneous speculations and discriminations. And 4. Words growing out of the discrimination that knows no beginning. Now, Mahamati, the words denoting individual marks rise from discriminating forms and characteristic signs as real in themselves and becoming attached to them. The dream words, Mahamati, rise from the unreal surroundings which reveal themselves before the mind when it recollects its previous experience. The words growing out of the attachment to erroneous speculations and discriminations, Mahamati, rise from recollecting deeds once previously committed. The words growing out of the discrimination that has been functioning since beginningless time, Mahamati, rise from the habit energy whose seeds have been growing out of the clinging to erroneous speculations and false imaginations since beginningless time. I say, Mahamati, these are the 4 features of word discrimination, which is the answer to your question. At that time again, Mahamati the Bodhisattva Mahasattva requested of the Blessed One to speak on this subject. Pray tell me again, Blessed One, about the conditions whereby the word discrimination manifests itself. Where, whence, how, and by whom do words indicating discrimination take place among the people? Said the Blessed One, Mahamati, the word discrimination goes on taking place by the coordination of the head, chest, nose, throat, palate, lips, tongue, and teeth. Said Mahamati again, Blessed One, are words to be considered different or not different from discrimination? Replied the Blessed One, Mahamati, they are neither different nor not different. Why? Because words rise, Mahamati, with discrimination as their cause. If, Mahamati, words are different from discrimination, they cannot have it for cause. Then, if they are not different, words cannot express the sense, which they do. Therefore, words and discrimination are neither different nor not different. Then Mahamati said, Again, Blessed One, are words themselves the highest reality, or is what is expressed in words the highest reality? The Blessed One replied, Mahamati, words are not the highest reality, nor is what is expressed in words the highest reality. Why? Because the highest reality is an exalted state of bliss, and as it cannot be entered into by mere statements regarding it, words are not the highest reality. Mahamati, the highest reality is to be attained by the inner realization of noble wisdom. It is not a state of word discrimination. Therefore, discrimination does not express the highest reality. And then, Mahamati, words are subject to birth and destruction. They are unsteady, mutually conditioning, and are produced by the law of causation. And again, Mahamati, what is mutually conditioning and produced by the law of causation cannot express the highest reality, because the indications pointing to the distinction between self and not self are non-existent. Mahamati, words are these indications and do not express the highest reality. Further, Mahamati, word discrimination cannot express the highest reality, for external objects with their multitudinous individual marks are non-existent, and only appear before us as something revealed out of mind itself. Therefore, Mahamati, you must try to keep yourself away from the various forms of word discrimination. Thus it is said, In all things there is no self-nature. Words, too, are devoid of reality. As the ignorant understand not what is meant by emptiness, yes, by emptiness, they wander about. In all things there is no self-nature. They are mere words of people. That which is discriminated has no reality. Even nirvana is like a dream. Nothing is seen to be in transmigration, nor does anything ever enter into nirvana. As a king or a wealthy householder, giving his children various clay-made animals, pleases them and makes them play with the toys, but later gives them real ones, so I, making use of various forms and images of things, instruct my sons, but the limit of reality can only be realized within oneself. At that time, Mahamati, the Bodhisattva Mahasattva, again said this to the Blessed One. Pray tell me, Blessed One, about the attainment of self-realization by noble wisdom, which does not belong to the path and the usage of the philosophers, which is devoid of all such predicates as being and non-being, oneness and otherness, bothness and not bothness, existence and non-existence, eternity and non-eternity, which has nothing to do with the false imagination, nor with individuality or generality, which manifests itself as the truth of highest reality, which going up continuously by degrees the stages of purification, enters upon the stage of Tathagatahood, which because of the original vows, unattended by any striving, will perform its works in infinite worlds like a gem reflecting a variety of colors, and which is manifested when one perceives how signs of individuation rise in all things as one realizes the course and realm of what is seen of mind itself. And thereby I and other Bodhisattva Mahasattvas are enabled to survey things from the point of view which is not hampered by marks of individuality and generality, nor by anything of the false imagination, and may quickly attain supreme enlightenment and enable all beings to achieve the perfection of all their virtues. Replied the Blessed One, well done, Mahamati, and again, well done indeed, Mahamati. Because of your compassion for the world, for the benefit of many people, for the happiness of many people, for the welfare, benefit, happiness of many people, both of celestial beings and humankind, Mahamati, you present yourself before me and make this request. Therefore, Mahamati, listen well and truly, and reflect, for I will tell you. Assuredly, said Mahamati the Bodhisattva Mahasattva, and gave ear to the Blessed One. The Blessed One said this to him, Mahamati, since the ignorant and the simple-minded, not knowing that the world is what is seen of mind itself, cling to the multitudinousness of external objects, cling to the notions of being and non-being, oneness and otherness, bothness and not bothness, existence and non-existence, eternity and non-eternity, as being characterized by self-nature, which rises from discrimination based on habit energy. They are addicted to false imaginings. Mahamati, it is like a mirage in which the springs are seen as if they were real. They are imagined so by the animals who, thirsty from the heat of the season, would run after them. Not knowing that the springs are their own mental hallucinations, the animals do not realize that there are no such springs. In the same way, Mahamati, the ignorant and simple-minded, with their minds impressed by various erroneous speculations and discriminations since beginningless time, with their minds burning with the fire of greed, anger, and folly, delighted in a world of multitudinous forms, with their thoughts saturated with the ideas of birth, destruction, and subsistence, not understanding well what is meant by existent and non-existent, by inner and outer, the ignorant and simple-minded fall into the way of grasping at oneness and otherness, being and non-being. Mahamati, it is like the city of the Gandharvas, which the unwitted take for a real city, though it is not so, in fact. This city appears, in essence, owing to their attachment to the memory of a city preserved in seed from beginningless time. This city is thus neither existent nor non-existent. In the same way, Mahamati, clinging to the memory of erroneous speculations and doctrines since beginningless time, they hold fast to ideas such as oneness and otherness, being and non-being, and their thoughts are not at all clear about what is seen of mind only. Mahamati, it is like a man who, dreaming in his sleep of a country variously filled with women, men, elephants, horses, cars, pedestrians, villages, towns, hamlets, cows, buffaloes, mansions, woods, mountains, rivers, and lakes, enters into its inner apartments and is awakened. While awakened thus, he recollects the city and its inner apartments. What do you think, Mahamati? Is this person to be regarded as wise, who is recollecting the various unrealities he has seen in his dream? Said Mahamati, indeed he is not, Blessed One. The Blessed One continued, in the same way, the ignorant and simple-minded, who are bitten by erroneous views, and are inclined toward the philosophers, do not recognize that things seen of the mind itself are like a dream, and are held fast by the notions of oneness and otherness, of being and non-being. Mahamati, it is like the painter's canvas on which there is no depression nor elevation as imagined by the ignorant. In the same way, Mahamati, there may be in the future some people brought up in the habit energy, mentality, and imagination based on the philosopher's erroneous views, clinging to the ideas of oneness and otherness, of bothness and not bothness. They may bring themselves and others to ruin. They may declare those people nihilists who hold the doctrine of no birth, apart from the alternatives of being and non-being. They argue against cause and effect. They are followers of the wicked views whereby they uproot meritorious causes of unstained purity. They are to be kept far away by those whose desires are for things excellent. They are those whose thoughts are entangled in the errors of self, other, and both, in the errors of imagining being and non-being, assertion and refutation, and hell will be their final refuge. Mahamati, it is like the dim-eyed ones who, seeing a hairnet, would exclaim to another, saying, it is wonderful, look, O honorable sirs. And the said hairnet has never been brought into existence. It is in fact neither an entity nor a non-entity, because it is seen and not seen. In the same manner, Mahamati, those whose minds are addicted to discrimination of the erroneous views as cherished by the philosophers, and who are also given up to the realistic ideas of being and non-being, oneness and otherness, bothness and not bothness, will contradict the good Dharma, ending in the destruction of themselves and others. Mahamati, it is like a firebrand wheel, which is no real wheel, but which is imagined to be of such character by the ignorant, but not by the wise. In the same manner, Mahamati, those whose minds have fallen into the erroneous views of the philosophers will falsely imagine, in the rise of all beings, oneness and otherness, bothness and not bothness. Mahamati, it is like those water bubbles in a rainfall which have the appearance of crystal gems, and the ignorant taking them for real crystal gems run after them. Mahamati, they are no more than water bubbles. They are not gems, nor are they not gems. Because of their being so comprehended by one party, and being not so comprehended by another. In the same manner, Mahamati, those whose minds are impressed by the habit energy of the philosophical views and discriminations will regard things born as non-existent, and those destroyed by causation as existent. Further, Mahamati, by setting up the 3 forms of measure and the 5 members of a syllogism, the philosophers make the discrimination that there is a reality existing by itself, which is attained by the realization of noble wisdom, and devoid of the 2 svabhavas. This discrimination, however, is not right. The Buddhist doctrine is this. Mahamati, when a psychological revulsion takes place in the yogins by the transcendence of the citta, manas, and vijnana, they cast off the dualistic discrimination of grasped and grasping in what is seen of mind itself, and entering the Tathagata stage, attain the realization of noble wisdom, and in this there is no thought of existence and non-existence. Again, Mahamati, if there is the grasping of existence and non-existence in the realm attained by the yogins, there will be in them the grasping of an ego, a nourisher, a supreme soul, or a person. Again, Mahamati, the teaching pointing to self-nature, individuality, and generality of things is that of the Transformation Buddha, and not that of the Dharmata Buddha. Again, Mahamati, such teaching is meant for the ignorant, being in conformity with their mentality, their way of thinking and viewing things. Any establishment that favors the way of self-nature fails to reveal the truth of self-realization to be attained by noble wisdom and by the blissful abode of the Samadhi. Mahamati, it is like the trees reflected in water. They are reflections and yet are not reflections. The trees are real figures and yet no figures. In the same manner, Mahamati, those who are impressed by the habit energy of the philosophical views carry on their discrimination regarding oneness and otherness, bothness and not bothness, being and not being, for their minds are not enlightened as regards what is seen of mind only. Mahamati, it is like a mirror reflecting all colors and images as afforded by the conditions and without discrimination. And they are neither images nor not images, because they are seen as images and also as not images. And Mahamati, they are discriminated forms of what is seen of mind itself, which are known to the ignorant as images. In the same manner, Mahamati, oneness and otherness, bothness and not bothness, are reflected images of self-mind, while they appear as if real. Mahamati, it is like an echo giving the sound of a human voice, of a river, or of the wind. It is neither existent nor non-existent, because it is heard as a voice, and yet not as a voice. In the same way, Mahamati, the notions of being and non-being, oneness and otherness, bothness and not bothness, are the discriminations of self-mind and habit energy. Mahamati, it is like a mirage, which in conjunction with the sun appears with its flowing waves on the earth, where there are no grass, shrubs, vines, and trees. They are neither existent nor non-existent, according to the desire for them or its absence. In the same way, Mahamati, the discriminating vijnana of the ignorant, which is impressed with the habit energy of false imaginations and speculations since beginningless time, is stirred like a mirage, even in the midst of reality revealed by means of noble wisdom, by the waves of birth, subsistence, and destruction, of oneness and otherness, bothness and not bothness, being and non-being. Mahamati, it is like Pishacha, who, by means of his spell, makes a corpse or a wooden image throb with life, though it has no power of its own. But here, the ignorant cling to the non-existent, imagining them to have the power of movement. In the same way, Mahamati, the ignorant and simple-minded committing themselves to the erroneous philosophical views are thoroughly devoted to the ideas of oneness and otherness, but their assertion is not at all well grounded. For this reason, Mahamati, in order to attain the noble reality attainable within yourself, you should cast off the discriminations leading to the notions of birth, abiding, and destruction, of oneness and otherness, bothness and not bothness, being and non-being. Therefore, it is said, the skandhas, of which the Vijnana is the fifth, resemble the reflections of the trees and water. They are to be regarded as maya and a dream. They are so by thought construction. Make no discriminations. This triple world resembles a hairnet, or water in a mirage which is agitated. It is like a dream, maya, and by thus regarding it, one is emancipated. Like a mirage in the springtime, the mind is found bewildered. Animals imagine water, but there is no reality to it. Thus the Vijnana seed is evolved, and the world comes into view. The ignorant imagine it is born, just like the dim-eyed ones perceive things in the darkness. Since beginningless time, the ignorant are found transmigrating through the paths, enwrapped in their attachment to existence. As a wedge is induced by another wedge, they are led to the abandonment of their wrappage. By regarding the world as always like a magically moving corpse, or a machine, or like a dream, or a lightning, or a cloud, the triple continuation is torn asunder and one is emancipated. There is here nothing of thought construction. It is like an image in the air. When they thus understand all, there is nothing to know. Here is nothing but thought construction and name. You seek in vain for individual signs. The skandhas are like a hairnet, wherein discrimination goes on. A world of multitudes is a hairnet, a vision, a dream, and the city of the Gandharvas. It is a wheel made by a firebrand, a mirage. It is a non-entity, only in appearance to people. Eternity and non-eternity, oneness too, bothness and not bothness as well. These are discriminated by the ignorant, who are confused in mind and bound up by errors since beginningless time. In a mirror, in water, in an eye, in a vessel, and on a gem, images are seen, but in them there are no images, i.e. realities, anywhere to take hold of. Like a mirage in the air, so is a variety of things mere appearance. They are seen in diversity of forms, but are like a child in a barren woman's dream. Further, Mahamati, the religious teaching of the Tathagatas is free from the four statements. That is, it is devoid of oneness and otherness, of bothness and not bothness. It is free from being and non-being, assertion and refutation. The religious teaching of the Tathagatas is headed by the Four Noble Truths, the 12-fold chain of origination, and the Eightfold Noble Path leading to emancipation. The religious teaching of the Tathagatas, Mahamati, is not fastened to these ideas: Prakriti, Ishvara, causelessness, spontaneity, atoms, time, and self-nature. Again, Mahamati, the Tathagatas, leading beings successively forwards, like the leader of a caravan, in order to purify them from the two hindrances of passion and knowledge, will establish them in the 108 statements of imagelessness, and also in the characteristic distinctions of the vehicles, of the stages of bodhisattvahood, and of the constituents of enlightenment. Further, Mahamati, there are four kinds of jhanas. What are the four? They are 1. The jhana practiced by the ignorant. 2. The jhana devoted to the examination of meaning. 3. The jhana with tathata, suchness, for its object, and 4. The jhana of the Tathagatas. What is meant by the jhana practiced by the ignorant? It is the one resorted to by the yogins exercising themselves in the discipline of the Shravakas and Pratyeka Buddhas, who, perceiving that there is no ego substance, that things are characterized with individuality and generality, that the body is a shadow and a skeleton which is transient, full of suffering, and is impure, persistently cling to these notions, which are regarded as just so and not otherwise, and who, starting from them, successively advance until they reach the cessation where there are no thoughts. This is called the jhana practiced by the ignorant. Mahamati, what then is the jhana devoted to the examination of meaning? It is the one practiced by those who, having gone beyond the egolessness of things, individuality and generality, the untenability of such ideas as self, other, and both, which are held by the philosophers, proceed to examine and follow up the meaning of the various aspects of the egolessness of things and the stages of bodhisattvahood. This is the jhana devoted to the examination of meaning. What, Mahamati, is the jhana with tathata for its object? When the yogins recognize that the discrimination of the two forms of egolessness is mere imagination, and that where he establishes himself in the reality of suchness, there is no rising of discrimination, I call it the jhana with tathata for its object. What, Mahamati, is the jhana of the Tathagata? When the yogin, entering upon the stage of Tathagatahood and abiding in the triple bliss which characterizes self-realization attained by noble wisdom, devotes himself for the sake of all beings to the accomplishment of incomprehensible works, I call it the jhana of the Tathagatas. Therefore it is said, there are the jhana for the examination of meaning, the jhana practiced by the ignorant, the jhana with tathata for its object, and the pure jhana of the Tathagata. The yogin, while in his exercise, sees the form of the sun or the moon, or something like a lotus, or the underworld, or various forms like sky, fire, etc. All these appearances lead him to the way of the philosophers. They throw him down into a state of Shravakahood, into the realm of the Pratyeka Buddhas. When all these are tossed aside and there is a state of imagelessness, then a condition in conformity with tathata presents itself, and the Buddhas will come together from all their countries and with their shining hands will stroke the head of the benefactor. At that time, the Bodhisattva Mahasattva again said this to the Blessed One, Thou speakest of nirvana, Blessed One. What is meant by this term, nirvana? Replied the Blessed One, when the self-nature and the habit energy of all the vijnanas, including the alaya, manas, and manovijnana, from which issues the habit energy of wrong speculations, when all these go through a revulsion, I and all the Buddhas declare that there is nirvana, and the way and the self-nature of this nirvana is emptiness, which is the state of reality. Further, Mahamati, nirvana is the realm of self-realization attained by noble wisdom, which is free from the discrimination of eternality and annihilation, existence and non-existence. How is it not eternality? Because it has cast off the discrimination of individuality and generality. It is not eternality. How about its not being annihilation? It is because all the wise men of the past, present, and future have attained realization. Therefore, it is not annihilation. Again, Mahamati, the great parinirvana is neither destruction nor death. Mahamati, if the great parinirvana is death, then it will be a birth and continuation. If it is destruction, then it will assume the character of an effect-producing deed. For this reason, the great parinirvana is neither destruction nor death. Neither has it anything to do with vanishing. It is the goal of the yogins. Again, Mahamati, the great parinirvana is neither abandonment nor attainment. Neither is it one of meaning nor of no meaning. This is said to be nirvana. Further, Mahamati, nirvana conceived by the Shravakas and Pratyeka Buddhas consists in recognizing individuality and generality, in escaping social intercourse, in not having a perverted view of the world, and not raising discrimination. This is their notion of nirvana. Thus concludes Chapter 2, Part 3 of the Laṅkāvatāra Sūtra. So that was Chapter 2, Part 3 of DT Suzuki's translation of the Lankavatāra Sutra. Docs, what did you think?
I liked this one a fair bit. There's a lot going on here, and unlike in the previous parts we were discussing, it's a lot more straightforward and easier to follow. Relative to what has come before in this sutra, there's a lot said with fewer words.
Absolutely. And I think that this one has a lot more of a coherent through line in terms of the question subjects and how they fit together than we have seen in the rest of Chapter 2.
Yeah.
I think that the topics don't wander as much.
They definitely don't. So, let's get into things specifically. So, early in the sutra, we get the Buddha saying, how again, Mahamati, does the Bodhisattva Mahasattva discard notions of birth, abiding, and disappearance? So, just to be clear, we're talking birth, living, and dying.
That's right.
Okay, so the key to doing that seems to be recognizing the world as an illusion, a projection from our mind. As we've said in previous discussions of this idea, it superficially resembles solipsism, but shakes that label because the person doing the projection is also an illusion, whereas in solipsism, the person projecting things is the only thing that's real.
Yeah, that's right. And it's interesting that this process also applies to how you understand causality with regard to inanimate objects. So this birth, abiding, and disappearance has to do not only with the self, but because the self is no different from other small d dharmas in the world, it applies also to those small d dharmas. We translate small d dharmas for our purposes as constituent pieces of reality, things in the world, but they can also be translated as phenomena. And it's weird for Western people to look at an object or something like that as a phenomenon, like this cup is a phenomenon, this computer is a phenomenon. But in a Buddhist sense of causality, it really is, because it's this sort of temporary fleeting state in between that which comes before it and that which will come after it. And the way that we get over this rigid, distinct, sequential way of looking at causality is we discard these categories that we impose on, the linear trajectory of a thing, from like pieces of computer to completed computer to decayed, rotten, turned to dust computer, if that makes sense. These are all sort of things our minds impose on to the thing, but it's not the thing itself. And no one single category or distinction we apply is going to capture the entirety of that trajectory, meaning that not only is our reality as we understand it a projection of mind, but it's also an incomplete and inadequate one.
That also makes the word choices of abiding and disappearance make more sense. I don't really think of a rock as something that can die, but it is something that can disappear. The only word that doesn't work very well there is birth, and it's close enough.
Sometimes they use the word arising, abiding, and disappearance, but it's sort of like splitting hairs from the perspective of translators or perspective of Buddhists, because this sort of arising, I guess anthropomorphizing it or not anthropomorphizing it, communicates the same phenomenon. When a human being is born, the condition that comes before is, that person's parents. And whenever a rock is quote unquote born, the condition that comes before is, sedimentation, right? And I guess that from a Buddhist perspective, you would look at the sediments as being a parent to the rock, and they sort of come together to form the rock itself. So I understand, I feel the same way in English about that, but the translators working from a more Buddhist perspective, they don't see that distinction very strongly.
I'm also a writer and an editor and a game designer, and your specific word choices can mean a lot more than what's going on here. So we've already talked about this more than it really needs. This is us being language nerds about it. So let's move forward. So next thing that caught me was the will body. So you said you wanted to talk about this first. So let's hear your discussion here.
Yeah, this is a very interesting component that comes up in the Laṅkāvatāra Sutra and in other mind-only discourses. So we're encouraged to understand our reality and ourselves as being mental projections, mental illusions that don't really capture what's really going on around us. It's up for debate if these projections are being projected onto a blank projection screen or if they're being projected onto a reality that actually has some things going on in it. But no matter what, we're supposed to get rid of or free ourselves from the projections, from the illusions, and from thinking of them as being real or being self. And I thought whenever I first learned about this stuff that the end point would be just discard those illusions and be happy, comfortable, equanimous, enlightened with the complete and total absence, with the emptiness, with the nothingness, with the zero that results. Not the darkness that results from turning off the projector, but sort of like that. The blankness that results from no longer projecting stuff onto reality. But that's actually not the end point. The end point is to go beyond that and attain something called the mind-made body. In Sanskrit, this is the Manomayakaya, like Manovijnana, but instead it is Manomayakaya, kaya meaning body. And the reason that you want this mind-made body is so that you can actually sort of travel to different Buddha lands and be introduced to the realm of the Tathagata. You need something like a reference point that, you don't just dissolve into the Force like, Obi-Wan Kenobi does. You actually have to become a Force ghost to be initiated and to be part of the realm of the Tathagatas. This is precisely the difference between reaching nirvana for yourself and being completely extinguished. And then on the one hand that there's that, and on the other hand is becoming a bodhisattva or becoming a fully realized Buddha and having this sort of will projection that can go and preach, that can go and arise in the world, that can do skillful means, that can do all these different things. And so this is sort of what's left whenever you discard the projection of your body and discard your illusion in thinking that that is self. So this is a very interesting sort of body because what is the form of it? Does it have arms and legs? Does it have a head? I guess it doesn't have to, but in imagery it usually does. It's fascinating because it's not like astral projection, but people often do read it as astral projection.
Including me.
Yeah, exactly. As I understand astral projection, that's something where you sort of create a dream body and send that body off to go do stuff in different planes of reality, different planes of existence. And it's really hard to find the difference in this, except for the fact that it's sort of a religious image for initiation into the realm of Tathagatas. The final point I want to make about the mind-made body before we leave it and move on is that it can, per other texts, per Abhidharma texts and other sutras, it can actually still be subject to delusion. So this mind-made body can meditate and hallucinate. And when I say hallucinate, I don't mean that like spontaneously it starts seeing flowers and colors and Volkswagen vans and stuff. I mean that during meditation on the way to realizing full Buddhahood, it can actually encounter these sort of demons or these sort of ghosts, projections of malevolent wills that try to distract you. So we've talked about how the Buddha meditated through 3 watches of the night, and during those 3 watches he had to fight off the armies of Mara. That is sort of embellished upon in later texts where instead of the physical body of a Buddha, you have a mind-made body, and instead of actual armies of demons, you have demons who are projecting themselves as gods, welcoming you into their realms. And you have to be so sure in your meditation that you are able to reject them. So they'll come to you in the form of a beautiful man or woman, and they'll say, "Congratulations, you've done it. You have achieved enlightenment. You have got it. You can relax now. You can chill out. You can rest on your laurels." And you're supposed to be good enough as a meditator to know, I can't do that. Buddhas don't stop doing that. And they don't stop doing meditation. They don't stop being Buddhas. And so you have to know better and sort of see through their tricks to try and tempt you. And sometimes you'll also hear music. There's all sorts of diversions that can come up. And since this is a mind-made body without real eyes, who sees these hallucinations? Do you see them in your mind? Do you see them in your consciousness? I don't really understand how that works. It's not very well defined, but it is something that canonically does happen. And it's one of the stranger or more peculiar things that happens in this strain of mind-only Buddhism that you don't really see in other ones. And so I just wanted to take a minute to talk about it and share some of the weird points about it, because it's mentioned more or less in passing here, but it's actually very important for mind-only Buddhism.
Yeah, when I read this, I definitely immediately was thinking about ideas of modern astral projection, which, like you said, basically dreaming yourself into another place or psychically projecting yourself to another place. And it makes sense that like the great yogins would be able to do this. Like these are beings that are enlightened or very close to it. And that comes with, as we've said before, omniscience. And if they have omniscience, then they can know what's going on anywhere. So the power part of this, the ability that the Buddha is talking about, at least superficially, really resembles astral projection. And in some of the like ways you get there, it also has a lot of resemblance. Like getting to astral projection, like I don't think this is a real thing, but for those who do, meditation or some variant that is very close to meditation is a core component of it.
Absolutely.
Meanwhile, this idea of a deceptive victory is a trope that's gone on a long time. And like here it is, like we just discussed it happening again, this idea of going along a spiritual path and then something tells you, hey, you've reached the top. Congratulations, you're done. There's multiple places throughout human storytelling where that's a trick and you're not really done. And this is an idea that comes up everywhere. Like this is a trope that comes up regardless of what culture is writing it.
Yeah, it co-evolves across many different places all across the world, and that's fascinating. I wonder if it is based in reality as much as something could be based in reality at all. I think that's sort of an unanswerable question, but it's fun to ask and think about.
Yeah, the point where these questions start having practical implications is significantly further than either of us are at right now, so I don't think lingering on that answer is going to be terribly productive because, like, we can't know that until we get there.
Right.
So the next section I wanted to talk about, the text I wrote down to remind me of this, is having a good insight into the non-existence of external objects. The core of this paragraph, it seems to be that since a bodhisattva mahasattva recognizes the external world as a mirage, they would look inward for truth, self-realization by their noble wisdom. Looking at the external world for wisdom is a poor use of time for practitioners this advanced because the world is marked by dukkha and they're trying to get away from that. If this is the correct interpretation, it seems to contradict what we've seen in other sutras, especially in esoteric traditions. Vairochana, being the universe, means everything has an enlightening aspect to it. And then in Mahāyāna stuff, we've got what Vimalakirti gets up to, where he is experiencing the world and like using the world as an enlightening tool. So there's some contradictions here. Now, it's contradiction. We've seen sutras contradicting each other a lot already, so not like super unexpected at this point, but it's still interesting to see different texts kind of butting heads like this.
Yeah, absolutely. And you have sort of touched on one of the main doctrinal differences or innovations that comes about. And mind-only Buddhism is at the hinging point of this innovation. So, historically speaking, mind-only Buddhism is very late early Buddhism, very early Mahāyāna. I know that sort of doesn't make a lot of sense when I use the words late and early 5 times.
It's on the transition between Mahāyāna and Theravada.
Yeah, exactly. And it comes about before we have any sort of doctrines of Buddha nature or of the Dharmakaya or of anything like that. And during the course of time where there's texts in this genre that are being authored, separately elsewhere, also Buddha nature and Dharmakaya stuff starts to come up. And these texts sort of have to deal with that and reckon with that in a way that is very current and very sort of, it's very much like an academic debate that is ongoing in real time. And that's not something we often get with these texts way back in the past because so few people were literate, so few texts have survived over time, and because there were so few people who were even interacting with each other as they made these. So it's very fascinating. On the whole, mind-only Buddhism is split 50-50 between those who think that Buddha nature and all of the world being potentially enlightening, they think that's impossible. They don't like any of that. And then the other half thinks all that is true and that's real. The people who don't think that the world is potentially enlightening, they don't think that there's a Dharmakaya and that everything in the world is a potential vehicle for enlightenment, they look to this text for their evidence and they say, yeah, it says the world is a mirage, an illusion. You should go and seek self-realization, noble wisdom. There's no need to, or even no use in finding awakening outside. The people who think that Buddha nature is real and then later think that the Dharmakaya and Vairocana is real, they all look to these later commentarial texts that aren't really sutras themselves, but they quote sutras a lot and they make arguments based on them and they pick and choose bits to discuss and to use as evidence for their argument. Those texts sometimes make use of different parts of this sutra to make their argument, but this is sort of a key moment for seeing that religious and doctrinal debate that goes on in Buddhism is exactly the same as religious doctrinal debate that goes on in all other major world religions. There's going to be people who are advancing their own agendas, their own exegeses, their own sort of interpretation of how things work, making use of the exact same texts, but just reading them completely differently. And while one verse or one chapter in this text says the external world is not useful, other parts will potentially suggest, if you read it from that perspective, that it is useful and that you can make some use of it. And for that reason, the mind-only genre, because it deals with that debate and because people make use of texts in that genre, in that debate, it is very, very complicated and it changes rather quickly compared to other strains of thought in Buddhism. There's other strains of thought in Buddhism that don't change for 1,000 years, 2,000 years. But in this, we're sort of watching, like we're watching the first side of an argument. And as we continue to read mind-only genre stuff over the course of the show, if we get to it all, then we're going to see that conversation happening in real time. And it's fascinating stuff.
The sutras kind of, if you force them to, can kind of create a timeline that's like a snapshot of the different ideas, and by looking at them in a sequence, you can see them evolve. Like, kind of like tree rings sort of deal, where you can see how it gets built on, and then in other places it gets knocked down. And it's kind of a snapshot of what the discussion was centuries before either of us were born. It's cool to see earlier humans having these conversations. It's in a religious context and it's being said with the voice of the Buddha, but there's also a human conversation going on here if you look for it.
Definitely. So the Laṅkāvatāra Sutra comes in the 2nd or 3rd century, I believe, and a lot of the Buddha nature and original enlightenment texts that we get, which are very important for Chan and for Pure Land as well, just like these sutras are, those texts come up in like 4th, 5th, 6th century, and then the esoteric Vairocana, Dharmakaya stuff comes in the 7th through the 9th century. And so there's like a 600-700 year debate going on, an engagement going on that all happens in that period of time among those texts. And the mind-only genre sort of spans that entire period of time and engages with all of that stuff at various points. And this is sort of speaking to the earliest texts we have, right? There might be earlier versions or something like that, prior to, but essentially philologists have made their profession of making this sequence that you're talking about and piecing together this conversation. I think that that's the entire context for what we see with any of the sutras that we've been reading and discussing on the show.
It also gives an idea of how much slower information moved back then. This conversation today with the internet involved would be like a matter of years instead of centuries.
Exactly.
All right, so let's move forward. The next thing we can talk about is the 6 causes. So this is kind of hard to parse. The language here is kind of vague in a way that makes it so we'd have to drill down into every single word to fully understand this. My attempt at this has been trying to parse things into an English summary. So here's what I came up with. Let me know if I have strayed somewhere. So first cause, possibility cause, is the thought it is possible for things to be different from each other. Next is dependence cause, which follows from possibility. Since different things are possible, I am separate from other things, and I can sense other things. Objectivity cause, meaning because I can sense other things, and my senses at least appear to be interacting with other things in a reasonable way, the notions that led me to these ideas are accurate. Agency cause, I am a separate thing that is able to act in the world. And then manifesting cause, I didn't really understand. Maybe it's the point where all of these ignorant views combine to create the illusion we're interacting with.
Yes, yeah, you're right. There's actually one more cause. There's the indifference cause.
Ooh, I missed that one.
The indifference cause means that when there is a dissolution, the power of combination discontinues, and there arises a state of non-discrimination. So basically, here's the one that breaks all of the rest of these apart. Here's what happens when they all fall apart. It's a type of cause that kills all the rest of them.
Gotcha.
So your parsing out is actually really good. I might actually take that, and if I ever have to teach something specifically related to this section, I might actually present it in those terms, if you're okay with that, because it is very, jargony in the text, but essentially you've nailed down exactly what's going on here. So possibility, it's possible for things to be different. That's the original delusion, the original mistake that people make, thinking that it's possible for there to be such a thing as difference. Interestingly, because, the sutra deals with this different and not different, bothness and oneness, or sameness and difference, existence and non-existence, the sutra deals with those dualities all throughout. And it's possible to make this possibility cause mistake with stuff not being different. So you can say the possibility cause for somebody could be the thought, it is impossible for things to be different from each other. Or otherwise stated, it is possible for things to be one and the same with each other. And the rest follows for all of the rest of the causes. Since different things are impossible, I am not separate from the things. And this whole thing is demonstrating how different types of causes function in the 12 links of dependent origination, and it's also demonstrating sort of the middle way. As these causes are presented is one extreme, and then presenting them the opposite way is the other extreme, and neither is true.
Permission granted to use this. I'm glad I got it that accurately, because like you said, this is jargony. It took me a while to figure this summary out because it's not, I don't want to say poorly conveyed, but the way it's conveyed makes it harder to parse than other stuff that's happening in this sutra.
Yeah, and it's actually not something that comes up in other texts a lot. It might be mentioned in passing, but this is one of the most complete and full descriptions of the 6 causes, if you can believe that, being as sort of thin and jargony as it is.
All right, so the next point we talk about is the idea simultaneous versus gradual arising. So basically, the Buddha cuts both of these ideas down as being completely impossible. Simultaneous arising doesn't work because time is a thing. Everything's not going to just pop into existence all at once. That's not how time works, so things can't arise simultaneously, but also things can't arise gradually because there's no anchor point. Because there is no time 1, there is no time 2, there is no time 3, etc. There's no single reference point. When we're using, in the modern context, we think of things generally being gradually arising. We're thinking about the universe expanding from the Big Bang. And the anchor point we have for that is the center of the universe, which we can calculate based on the positions of everything moving away. The historical Buddha and his disciples wouldn't have had access to that knowledge or the technology needed to find it. But even if they did, that's based on measurements we're making with our senses, which he's told us over and over not to rely on. So even with the center of the universe idea as a central reference point for a gradual arising, it still doesn't hold up in the Buddhist context.
That's exactly right. And listeners might hear us say there's no simultaneous arising because time, but there's also no gradual arising because sequence relies on a starting point. They might think after hearing that, well, what is there? What's going on? How does this work? It's kind of an anxious and uncomfortable uncertainty, a floating, if you will, of reality, a floating of things that there's no anchor point. It could sort of go anywhere at any time. And if you're feeling that way, that's it. You're right. That's kind of the core of emptiness, is that there might be relative continuity, as in I'm a person right now, and I'm probably going to continue to be a person for the foreseeable future, but on a grand astronomical scale, however many nayutas of kalpas or whatever, it's really that impermanent, and it's really that uncertain, and it's really that holographic, that mercurial and nebulous, according to the Buddhist system. So if you do feel like curiosity, if you do feel anxiety, if you do feel uncertainty about how that works, the Buddha does argue that is the first step to understanding it. That is the first step to getting into emptiness, getting into suchness, understanding that things don't exist, but they also don't not exist, and how you can reconcile those two truths. That's a very important part of the sutra.
And that anxiety about what's going on, if this isn't what's going on, like that's the first step to unknowing. That's a step into Zen sickness if it's too strong a feeling. And in general, it's this idea of not being set on any beliefs. It's kind of, and I hesitate to use this term because it's associated with some questionable folks, but it's kind of like a pan-agnostic idea. I don't know anything 100%. There are certain things I know with a 99.9999999% certainty, like I suspect the sun is still going to exist tomorrow. But pan-agnostic viewpoint is basically saying always leave room for you to be wrong, for your expectations to be incorrect, for knowledge to be updated or turn out to be wrong. And it seems like that's kind of what's trying to happen here at this step, is easing the participant into not being sure about anything. And it seems like up until the enlightenment moment, there's a lot of uncertainty involved in the Buddhist path, whichever version you go with.
Exactly, yeah. That is how this step works. And it's fascinating because we just recorded the 3 very short sutras, and we just talked about how there is this uncertainty and anxiety when people learn that they're not going to exist forever, when people learn that they don't have an abiding self that not only goes through rebirths, but also never dissolves, never disintegrates. It may take on different forms, like a different body, but still stays you forever. They learn in Buddhism that that's not the case. And then they learn that that's the case with everything all the time, everywhere. There's no certainty that it'll exist forever. And then when you bring up pan-agnosticism, you're talking about this idea of being okay with the not knowing and being open-minded to the uncertainty and open-minded and comfortable with the changing. That is sort of actually kind of a trap on the Buddhist path. If you get too comfortable there, then you actually won't advance to the final step, which is you do know how all these things work. You do know what comes next. You do have certainty. You get to the step of omniscience, and all of the stuff works the same way, but now you no longer have any sort of lack of certainty as to what happens next. You have unlocked the secret key to causality, which you previously thought worked one way, you found out worked a different way, and now that you know it works a different way, you have figured out how it actually works.
Yeah, the uncertain step eventually goes away, but it is also, based on what all we've talked about on this show, it's also extremely important to be there for possibly even most of that path.
Yeah, it is.
So next, let's talk about the 4 kinds of word discrimination. The 4 kinds of words are words that arise from attachment to illusions, words that are reinforced by memory, words reinforced by past deeds, words reinforced by discriminatory and calculatory thinking. So, looking at that list, it seems like it's not a list where this word arises from attachment to illusions, this other word is reinforced by past deeds. It seems like a given word can be in all 4 of those categories. So the word apple. When the word apple comes from attachment to illusions, that's when you learn what an apple is, but you are learning it through your senses, which are imperfect. The second aspect, words that are reinforced by memory, comes from just remembering apples exist and the apples you have observed before. Words that are reinforced by past deeds could be like, hey, I have eaten an apple before. And then words reinforced by discriminatory and calculatory thinking, describing apples through the ages, describing apples that are the difference between a green apple and a golden delicious, or whatever types of apples you prefer. Is that accurate?
Yeah, it is. So these 4 aspects, they apply sort of to all language all the time. These 4 aspects, these 4 types of word discrimination, they are 4 ways for understanding nouns, and it's very easy to do so with nouns. But it's important to note that they also apply to all other types of words. So they apply to verbs, they apply to articles, adjectives, adverbs, etc. And it can be harder to parse out these different stages with other types of words, but essentially it works the same. For example, the verb to run, you could do this exact same thing with the verb to run, and the word to run implies that there is a self that is running, a person that is running, and so arising from attachment to an illusion of the existence of a self to run, and then it could be reinforced by past memory of seeing other people run or running yourself, reinforced by past deeds, again, running in the past, reinforced by discriminatory and calculatory thinking, thinking of running as not being walking, not being sitting, and not being standing. So it applies to all words all the time. This is fascinating because it's not made perfectly clear here if these word discriminations mean that all language is inherently unenlightening, is inherently insufficient, is inherently bad in terms of, getting further on the path. My interpretation is that the text is sort of against language because I know contextually that Chan Buddhism, it rejects language a lot because of all of the dialectical thinking that goes on whenever language is used and overused on the Buddhist path, but the text itself does not conclusively say, and also these 4 kinds of discrimination mean that language is illusory and also bad and also not worth pursuing as a means of enlightenment, because we also know that in Chan there's the development of koans. We know that the Buddha uses language skillfully and uses it in an enlightening way, and he's not being self-critical here. So I think that it's ambiguous, and that's a fascinating component.
I mean, again, going back to what we were talking about being panagnostic, the words aren't quite enough. The way I read this text, I also agree that it's saying that words are flawed, but I don't think it's quite saying that words are useless. For example, the sutra is language. This is all text on a page that we're reading. So the sutras are language. the meanings of the sutras are conveyed through language. And without that language, the Buddha can't communicate with us. So my reading of this is that language is not ideal, but also it's the best we've got. So this section of the 4 kinds of words is a warning sign, the asterisk above the description being like, hey, this is what we've got, but it's not quite enough. You have to be able to work in this world if you're not yet enlightened. And if you are enlightened, you still need to be doing that too. It's not useless, but it's also not enough. And these 4 kinds of words here are the types of flaws you need to be worrying about when you're thinking about language.
I think that that's a correct interpretation, and I think that that is supported by the section that we get right before it transitions to section 34 of the sutra, where there's a question by Mahamati. He just kind of breaks it down, and he's like, enough about these discriminations, enough about these distinctions. Is language the highest reality, or is what is expressed in language the highest reality? And the Buddha says, no, neither of those things. You have to go past language. You have to go past words to enjoy enlightenment due to self-realization of noble wisdom, right? In self-realization, there is no language, right? Because you're not supposed to be having an internal monologue while you're having, satori, or an internal enlightenment experience. It's supposed to be a conceptual, a feeling, an inclination, a sort of reshaping of the mind that is, by definition, ineffable. It's an individualized, unique experience that cannot be put into words and cannot be described and conveyed and caused by giving language or doing language unto something or somebody else. But language can refer to it. And in referring to it, that's a good thing. We need it to be able to refer to it, but it can't do it. It can't be it.
So the next thing I noted that I want to talk about, they may declare those people nihilists who hold the doctrine of no birth apart from the alternatives of being and non-being. So this is some preemptive defense against the nihilism accusation that we've talked about before. And in this case, it's valid and I think correct. From the outside and without the context built up from reading all that we have read, these sutras can sound very nihilistic, like the world is an illusion, you are not real, language is insufficient. Without the context, these are intimidating and dispiriting ideas. With the context, we get to understand why all of these things are actually a good thing. But without it, we're saying you don't exist. That's nihilistic.
Yeah, I agree. And I think I made a note of this part because I love whenever these sutras in the Buddha's voice anticipate arguments and refutations and accusations that the text is going to get. It's sort of metatextually aware of itself. The other text that does this a lot and that we spend a lot of time discussing on this topic on is the Lotus Sutra.
Yep.
And it's so concerned with how people think of it. And it's a long sutra. It's very long, but there is so much of it that is simply directed to these detractors of the teaching. And there's so much of that. You sometimes also forget what the actual teaching is that is going to be refuted, slandered, detracted, etc. And that's not the case here in the Laṅkāvatāra Sutra, but it's one of these windows into the minds of the authors of the text that we rarely get, right? Because when we're reading the rest of this, we're reading it religiously. We're reading it as though the text believes the claims that it's making, and we read it as though the Buddha actually is the person making the claims, and so on, right? We're not usually being cynical about what's going on. But when we see these little moments like this, that's our reminder, oh yeah, this was authored by people, and they are concerned with what people are going to think about what they have written and what they have done, and they need to address that in this text. And that's not something that often happens in other religious texts. We have threats in other texts, like you're going to end up in hell or you're going to not go to heaven. And that's a threat that we get in this text as well. But there's not really always a doctrinal explanation for why the other side is wrong. it's just sort of implied that you're supposed to believe what you're reading and not believe what people say about what you're reading. And in this text, we get both. We get the threat and we also get the explanation. And it's always fascinating to see.
We're only in chapter 2, so I might be wrong about this, but so far, the Lankavatāra version of this seems pretty reasonable to me. It is a reasonable prediction of how people who don't have the whole thing are going to react to it. And yeah, that's a reasonable thing to address within a text. There are other less religious texts that do this kind of thing as well. Scientific texts, for example, need to proactively think of ways others are going to challenge that data and have a explanation ready. So it's not that common in religious texts, but it is a thing that happens and it is a useful thing.
Yes.
This is a practical message of like, hey, I know this sounds nihilistic. Chill, let me get through. That is a useful thing to add to this text.
Absolutely, yeah. Stick with it because you're going to see why that's not the case.
Or rather, you're going to see why you should be happy about it.
Yeah.
There's a lot of ways that this ends up being a good thing, but there's a process to get there.
Absolutely.
We have a couple of spots where the text says, and hell will be their final refuge. And I'm thinking, oh, this is DT Suzuki who is trying to appeal to Western and Christian sensibilities. That sounds very Christian to me, and is another spot where I think the translator's agenda comes through. And also, like, there is no final refuge other than nirvana and enlightenment. Hell is not permanent in Buddhism. So that is also incorrect.
Yeah, it's a complete addition, right? I mean, there's no final refuge at all. And I think that you're right that this is appealing to Christians. He's like, we need to put some fire and brimstone in there, or else people are going to think that this religion doesn't have any stakes. They're not going to think it has any punishment for being bad, right? Especially knowing that there's, all of this skillful means stuff. And he's also writing this at the time aware of the Vimalakirti Sutra and of the Lotus Sutra and these other texts, which we've talked about, like, hey, we feel a little bit uncomfortable, morally speaking, about what's being presented here because it's potentially bad. It's not bad in the text, but it could be bad. And it has been historically used to justify morally bad things. And so he's trying to put this in here and be like, Buddhism's not like that at all. It is morally absolutist. And that is an incorrect presentation.
That's just wrong and borderline deceptive.
Yes. It's debatable if there's like an Achantaka situation going on here, but like...
Achantakas aren't trapped in hell.
Exactly. Even if there is an Achantaka discourse going on here, Achantakas can be all the way up to the level of bodhisattvas, like we talked about before. So there's not any reason to think that they'll be living in hell, and there's absolutely no reason to think they'll be living in hell forever.
In fact, we have assurances that that's not what's going to happen. Again, this is wrong.
Right.
Okay, moving on. A phrase that came up that I don't understand. 5 members of a syllogism. So, this feels like either a translation fumble or responding to a specific thing that doesn't really exist in our modern context. Can you get some insight on what's going on here?
This 5 members of a syllogism point is talking about the 5 different claims or the 5 different types of claims that philosophers make to discount Buddhist causality, to discount that Buddhism doesn't believe in a prime mover or a prime material that leads to the creation and the continuation of all reality. And I don't have the complete list right now, but it's just speaking to the fact that these philosophers make these 5 different sort of types of claims and these 5 different refutations. And in doing so, it's presented here as a syllogism because these claims or these refutations or these slanders of the Dharma, as the Buddha would see them, they are advancing an agenda based on a non-reality or based on an untruth. They're presenting something in a different way according to their agenda, right? And so that's why it's been translated here as a syllogism. And so it's something that got lost in translation, but it is essentially speaking about the philosophers.
Right. And even the word philosopher doesn't necessarily mean the same thing that it does now that it did then. So
yeah,
it seems like this is a case where the text is responding to a context that does not exist in the modern day.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. So next point I noted, and this is just noting a figure from folklore, the Pisaka. Basically cannibal demons who have like necromancy powers. So it's talking about Pisaka who by means of a spell makes a corpse or wooden image throb with life, la 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 la. That's a interesting figure from the folklore. Is Pisaka also something you would see in Hindu ideas as well?
Yeah. So they're supposed to be pronounced Pishacha, but it's not really clear from the letters or the spelling about that, so that's totally fine. I've actually heard professors say Pisaka, so it's totally fine.
It's a matter of, like, C is supposed to be CH and K is supposed to be the C sound, and I forget that fairly frequently.
And there's different transliterations of Sanskrit, so that's always a problem. But it's essentially, a flesh-eating demon from Indian mythology with necromancy powers. What's interesting about them is that they are humanoid enough in the texts where they come up that it's possible that this could be, and this is complete speculation, it could be a derogatory term for a group or a tribe or a confederation of people who are cannibals in late Indian prehistory. So sometimes whenever there's monsters in a religious text or a mythological text, they're not actually monsters. They're actually these like embellished, very derogatorily described people that are functioning as monsters in the text in order to make them out to be bad, right? And so it's possible that these were actually people.
We see that in other religions as well. The Christian idea of the Whore of Babylon was referring to a specific pope that people did not like.
Exactly. Yeah, this is a very common thing. And so these Pishacha, they haunt cemeteries and charnel grounds. They can shapeshift. And what's important is that they feed on human energy. So they can possess people, they can cast spells, they can enchant people, and they eat or they nourish themselves on vidya. Vidya is like our exertion, our vitality, our energy for doing something.
Okay. So kind of a psychic vampire idea in the modern context.
Yeah, exactly.
So at one point we have the term religious teaching of the Tathagatas in this sutra. We've talked before, the languages this sutra came from did not have a word for religion, right? That's something that came up after encountering Western cultures. So what's going on? What is being translated into religious teaching here? Possibly the capital D Dharma?
Yes, it's the capital D Dharma. This is a translation choice that I think is, frankly, kind of unforgivable. We've seen the word Dharma, big D Dharma, all throughout this text before. And we've had the Buddha referring to it, and we've had the Buddha talking about it. And there's no reason to choose now to add in an anachronistic adjective, the religious teaching. There was no word for religion in India or in China or in Nepal or in Central Asia before the colonial encounter in the 18th century. And even once that encounter happened, there was debate and uncertainty and anxiety about what it meant and how it was different from what has been translated in this text potentially as the philosopher's teaching, right? We talked about how that's kind of referring to what we would now understand as a secular teaching, but really back then was not secular. It's just a translation choice. Here he's trying to strike a contrast that is very strong between what the philosophers are up to, which is actually Brahmanical in nature, is not secular at all, and what the Buddha is up to, which he categorizes as religious. But this is not in good faith. This is not accurate. This is one of the places where his agenda comes through strongest and where it rubs me the wrong way the most, because the original word is dharma, or you could even say subtle dharma, or you could say subtle teaching, or you could say any number of things instead. And instead, he's decided to do religious teaching because he has to remind people that Buddhism is a religion. and it's a religious alternative to other religions that you might not be happy with. And we've talked before about how that leads to all sorts of problems. So I really don't like that that's happened here.
Yeah, it's also why I brought it up, because it stood out. It sticks out because, like you said, capital D Dharma is in this text already. So, yeah, now that I know that's what's going on, I agree with you completely. That's another spot where I have criticisms for Mr. Suzuki. So, the next subject is how nirvana is treated in this portion. So, the idea is that nirvana is neither eternality nor is it extinction, existence or non-existence. And I am quite dissatisfied with the reasoning that comes out of this. It seems almost dismissive, almost like a non-answer. It seems to me kind of like a kid going, this is how things are, and that the question is, how is it not eternality, is answered in one sentence that doesn't really tell me much. I don't understand how that answer goes to that question, and the same thing about how it is not annihilation as well. So, let's talk about this. What's going on here?
So, to put it in very brief, slightly comical terms, your princess is in another castle. So, this section is laying the groundwork for redefining nirvana, peri-nirvana, as being sort of the final extinction, where when that happens, you're done, you don't come back into samsara ever again, and it's all over. You are no longer part of samsara. You are no longer a constituent piece of this reality because you have ceased to act karmically and have therefore divested yourself from the conventional day-to-day sequence of causality that we deal with in our lives. In earlier Buddhism, we thought, yes, that's how it worked. Eventually, the Buddha is going to die. And because he's enlightened, and because he's attained nirvana, he's not going to come back. This text is like a middle step, and then the final step is something like the Lotus Sutra, where it says, actually, when you reach peri-nirvana, you don't actually die. You're just arising in the world and then ceasing in the world. But this is all an act of the mind-made body. This is all something that you are sort of projecting into samsara because you're omniscient, because you are a Buddha now and you have the power and the ability to do that. So this is the middle step where it doesn't explain that peri-nirvana is not actually death. It doesn't explain that nirvana is not actually the final step. It doesn't explain that the word nirvana, which means extinction, which means annihilation, which means to be blown out, does not actually mean to be blown out. This is where we sort of start to hinge on our definition in the transition from early Buddhism to Mahāyāna. And that's kind of why, if I have to read this critically, I might say to myself, okay, they're not being really super specific because they haven't figured it out themselves. They don't really understand how it works themselves, but they want to advance this idea that nirvana is, not actually nirvana from a linguistic, strictly definition-based point of view. But they want to lay this groundwork. They want to start us thinking about how it's possible, the authors of this text. So it's a situation where you have to keep reading other stuff to find out. It's a situation where the secret to it all gets revealed historically, textually, a bit later and in different places than this. So that's something that it's kind of unfortunate. This text, it's a shortcoming of this text that it doesn't have the specific answer here, but it does point to an answer that will come elsewhere and will come later.
So, end result for the discussion on nirvana, like you said, got to go look at other texts. The answer is not really here.
One thing that I think is narratively fascinating is that we remember when we read the Pali Canon version of the Buddha's final nirvana, the death of the Buddha, Ananda is very upset about it. And the Buddha kept saying, I've been telling you this whole time. I've been telling you over and over again that I'm going to die. And Ananda is not here for this conversation. Whenever the Buddha says peri-nirvana is not complete total vanishing, it's not death or destruction, Ananda doesn't hear that. And so it's a very unique point where, narratively speaking, the authors of this text have had to have characters be in different places in order for the text to make sense. Because the Pali-Canon Mahaparinirvana Sutra was authored before the Laṅkāvatāra Sutra. And so they understood that it would be a weakness of the text, I think, if instead of Mahamati listening to all of this, it was Ananda listening to all of this, because he would have heard the truth about parinirvana and then later on not known the truth about parinirvana, which would have been, textually speaking, kind of like throwing Ananda under the bus.
Ananda's also supposed to be the person who recalls these sutras, though. So where do we get the sutra from if Ananda's not there?
From a lineage point of view, we actually get it from Mahamati. So Ananda is the one who records all of the Pali Sutras, but they sort of do away with that rule whenever Mahāyāna texts start to be authored in the Buddha's voice.
Right.
And sometimes, there's also this divine inspiration issue where some people much later on, like 1,000 years, 1,200 years after the Buddha has died, they'll write something in his voice and say they got it from somebody who wasn't even historical, somebody who is in a constructed cosmology. And so that's a whole thing.
So, okay, the missing step there was Ananda is not the source necessarily for Mahāyāna stuff.
Not in every case. Sometimes they'll put him in there to give it the same status and the same acclaim and the same credibility that the Pali Sutras have. But once Mahāyāna people start to turn against the Pali Sutras, then Ananda's not always there.
Makes sense. All right. That was all I had. Was there anything I missed that you want to talk about?
Nope, I'm all set.
All right. In that case, I think we have an episode.
I think so. So that was Chapter 2, Part 3 of the Lankavatāra Sutra. We hope you enjoyed, and we hope we see you next time.
Thank you for listening.
Hi, Nick here. Just wanted to jump in at the top of the show to say big thank you to our two patrons, Tanner and Wooly. If you would like to join them, you can find us on patreon.com/brightonbuddhism, all one word. Thank you very much for your support, and we hope you enjoy the show. My name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions and the voice of Hearer.
And I'm Docs, editor, question asker, producer, and voice of Hermit.
And this has been Bright on Buddhism. Thank you for listening. If you like our podcast, or if you have a question you'd like for us to discuss, we'd love to hear from you. Please consider leaving a comment, a review, or subscribing, or joining us on social media. Email us at bright.on.buddhism@gmail.com, or find us on Patreon at patreon.com/brightonbuddhism. As always, citations and resources for this episode can be found in the show notes. Thank you.